Thank you.
And now, Mr. Moraes, Chair of the LIBE Committee, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, President. Thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg, for being here, and we hope that our committee will examine further with Facebook executives and so on in depth. And this is for people who are watching this web stream and want a more in-depth investigation. I think Mr. Farage slightly characteristically talked about how prolific he was on Facebook. I may be the most modest user of Facebook in the room, but our committee is not modest in any way. We are celebrating this week GDPR, but I do want to mention that GDPR, in my view, and we have the rapporteur here, is not something that will impact entirely on your business model, and I think you know this. E-privacy is essential also, and there's a reason I mention e-privacy is because there is a regulatory framework here, and I want to mention something very obvious. You're not in the congressional hearing, you've come to the European Union, and there's a big difference, and the difference mentioned by some of my colleagues I want to make very explicit, and that is that we are here in terms of regulation, and the United States is here. And this gap is very obvious. It's obvious in our adequacy agreements. It's obvious in the day-to-day transactions we have between the continents. But for you, it is a real detailed question of how you will comply. Now, I know that you will say, of course, we're going to comply with GDPR, but it is a much bigger task than I think people are estimating, and no doubt the rapporteur will say something about that in a moment. Now, in your introduction, you spoke, I think, quite eloquently about what you thought was one of the key points, which was the app question. And I think you mentioned it because it is really the critical point. What I wanted to ask, and colleagues are talking about crowdsourcing questions, the question I've been asked by individuals, journalists and others, is whether the question of protection of privacy and the rules on Facebook apps, which you were asked in Congress, is actually the tip of the iceberg, or is there a bigger iceberg? Now, you're addressing this because it's important. So I really do need to repeat this because specifically, given that Facebook was forced to review the apps authorised on the platform, I'll be quick, President, I promise. This is the problem about going last, of course. Following this, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and now that I think you've blocked around 200 of these apps since the congressional hearings, you've come here having blocked 200 of them. I mean, isn't this, first of all, a clear signal that Facebook failed to protect the privacy of its users? We have 252 million, I think, in the European Union. That's more than in the United States. And it gives us the question of that you should really provide us with the detailed measures, and you have some of these, that Facebook will implement to ensure a thorough analysis of apps that are allowed on Facebook. And really, why did you not inform users of these problems to enable them to take measures to protect their data? And President, if you just allow me, the bottom line for you, I think, and for Facebook, is we need to know in Europe the true scale of the violations of users' data by third-party apps. We really need to get an estimate of this. And we need to know what it means to commit to GDPR. If I just give you one example, the GDPR gives individuals a right to access and verify all the data a company holds on them. And that includes not just their profiles mentioned by another colleague, but also the marketing profiles, data that was not disclosed by the user but interpreted from his or her behaviour. Are you really going to give users full access to their marketing profiles? Are you going to do or complete all of the steps in GDPR? Never mind e-privacy. And really want to just to say in conclusion here, the question of the difference between GDPR and what is in the United States, the gap must be closed. But for you, given that you are here, and I try to be brief because we will go in more depth, it's not just that you have to comply with GDPR, but you have to remember that you're here in the European Union where we created GDPR. So we ask you to make a legal and moral commitment, if you can, to uphold EU data protection law, to think about e-privacy, to protect the privacy of European users and the many millions of European citizens and non-Facebook users as well. And this is a moral and legal obligation and implementation. And I really ask you to think about this because you've come here not to Congress but to the European Union, and we have expectations. Thank you.
Last question.